The Islamic New Year, also known as the Hijri New Year, quietly marks the beginning of a new chapter in the Islamic lunar calendar. Unlike the widely celebrated Gregorian New Year, which bursts into life with fireworks and festivities, the Islamic New Year begins with contemplation, reverence, and often silence. It starts on the first day of Muharram, one of the 4 sacred months in Islam, and is grounded in the historical migration or Hijrah of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and his followers from Mecca to Medina. This moment was not merely a change in geography, but a defining act of faith, sacrifice, and the birth of a new Islamic society. For this reason, the Islamic calendar begins from that pivotal event, with the year of the migration designated as 1 Anno Hijri, or in the year of the Hijra. Although the Islamic New Year holds profound significance, it remains less understood or recognized outside of religious circles. Many Muslims themselves may know only the basic premise of its connection to the Hijra or the fact that it falls in Muharram. However, behind this quiet observance lies a rich world of spiritual meanings, cultural variations, and historical depth that has evolved over centuries and across civilizations. In many parts of the Muslim world, the day is not marked by outward celebration, but rather by internal reflection. It is a time to remember the courage and resilience of those who risked everything for their faith, and to consider how that legacy applies to one's own spiritual journey today. Throughout Islamic history, the Hijri New Year has served as a moment of spiritual reset. It is a reminder that time in Islam is not just a measure of days and months, but a vehicle for accountability, gratitude, and renewal. Muslims believe that during sacred months like Muharram, the reward for good deeds is multiplied, and so many use this time to fast, offer special prayers, or seek forgiveness. It is also a month of historical importance, particularly for the Shia Muslim community, who remember the martyrdom of Husayn ibn Ali, the grandson of the Prophet, on the 10th day of Muharram, known as Ashura. That tragic event in Karbala continues to inspire themes of justice, moral courage, and sacrifice. Yet there is much more to the Islamic New Year than these commonly known themes. The Hijri calendar, its mechanics, its influence on law and worship, the variety of customs across cultures, and the many ways in which communities have commemorated this turning point throughout the centuries. All of these aspects hold fascinating and often overlooked details. From astronomical calculations to poetry written in its honor, from the calligraphy that marks the new year to the oral traditions passed through generations, the Islamic New Year carries with it a treasury of insight waiting to be uncovered. This collection, 100 Facts About the Islamic New Year You Have Never Heard Before, seeks to open that treasury. Whether you are a devout Muslim seeking deeper knowledge or a curious reader interested in world religions, the facts that follow aim to illuminate the profound and often surprising dimensions of this sacred moment in the Islamic calendar. By exploring these lesser-known insights, we hope to deepen appreciation for a tradition that has quietly shaped centuries of devotion, identity, and spiritual growth. 1. The Hijri calendar was introduced by Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab in 638 CE. When Caliph Umar governed the expanding Muslim state, he faced growing administrative challenges. Letters and contracts were being exchanged across regions, but there was no standardized system for dating them. Umar consulted his advisors and, after much deliberation, chose the year of the Prophet Muhammad's migration, Hijra, from Mecca to Medina, as the beginning of the Islamic calendar. This decision was not just logistical, it was symbolic. The Hijra marked the birth of a new Muslim society based on justice, faith, and collective identity. By anchoring the calendar to this event, Umar emphasized the values of sacrifice and community over mere chronology. The calendar became known as the Hijri calendar, or Anno Hijri, and it was a defining moment in Islamic governance. This system is still used by Muslims today for religious observances like Ramadan, Hajj, and Islamic New Year, reflecting its enduring importance. 2. The month of Muharram begins the Islamic New Year, but it's not marked with celebration. Unlike January honest in the Gregorian calendar, the Islamic New Year marked by the first day of Muharram ushers in a time of quiet reflection rather than celebration. Muharram, one of the 4 sacred months in Islam, is considered a time when fighting is forbidden and spiritual deeds are emphasized. For many Muslims, the arrival of a new Hijri year invites contemplation, renewed intentions, and acts of devotion. Historically, there has never been a tradition of feasting or fireworks. Instead, scholars encouraged believers to use the occasion to review their actions from the past year and seek forgiveness. In Shia Islam, Muharram is especially solemn due to the remembrance of the martyrdom of Imam Husayn at Karbala on the 10th day, Ashura. As such, many communities enter the year in a state of mourning. The tone is reverent rather than jubilant, emphasizing the sacred over the festive. 3. The Islamic calendar starts not with a birth or conquest, but with a migration. The Islamic New Year begins from the Hijrah migration of the Prophet Muhammad from Mecca to Medina, note from his birth, a military victory or a divine revelation. This choice is deeply symbolic. When the early Muslim community faced persecution in Mecca, the Prophet's migration to Medina marked the beginning of a new phase, one of freedom, community building, and formal Islamic governance. Choosing this moment as the start of the calendar was a profound declaration that Islam values moral courage and peaceful perseverance over temporal power. It wasn't about celebrating triumph, but recognizing the spiritual significance of migration for faith's sake. The year of the Hijra became one Ahi, Anno Hegire. This shift in geography mirrored a shift in strategy and spirit, showing that history's turning points can be defined not by empires, but by principles. It also gave the calendar a unique ethical foundation distinct from others. 4. Islamic New Year was not always recognized widely across the Muslim world. In the early centuries of Islam, the Islamic New Year wasn't marked by any large public observance. While the start of Muharram was acknowledged, it wasn't until later dynasties like the Abbasids and Fatimids that more formal recognition and rituals developed in some regions. Even today, the way Islamic New Year is observed varies significantly by country and tradition. Some Sunni-majority nations give the day a quiet, reverent recognition, while in Shia-majority areas, the focus is primarily on mourning ceremonies for Ashura. Additionally, many Muslims are more familiar with dates like Ramadan or Eid, while honest Muharram can pass with little notice outside of scholarly circles. This variance is a reminder that Islamic traditions are not monolithic. While the calendar unites Muslims globally, its symbolic milestones like the New Year are interpreted and internalized in diverse ways, influenced by theology, culture, and history over time. 5. The Islamic calendar is lunar, and thus its new year rotates through all seasons. One unique feature of the Islamic calendar is that it is purely lunar, consisting of 12 months of 29 or 30 days each. This makes the Hijri year approximately 10 to 11 days shorter than the solar year used in the Gregorian calendar. As a result, the Islamic New Year and all Islamic holiday cycle through the seasons over a 33-year period. For instance, the 1st of Muharram might fall in summer, 1 year in winter, in another. This rotation gives Muslims across the globe a chance to experience sacred times in various climatic and cultural contexts. This lunar mobility reflects Islam's universal message: it is not tethered to a particular geography or climate. Moreover, the changing seasons encourage believers to approach familiar rituals with fresh perspectives. The Islamic New Year serves as a reminder of time's constant motion and the need for continual spiritual renewal regardless of season. 6. The sighting of the new moon determines the exact start of the Islamic New Year. The Islamic calendar begins each month with the sighting of the new crescent moon, Hilal. This practice is rooted in both prophetic tradition and natural observation, which connects timekeeping with celestial cycles. For the Islamic New Year, this means the first day of Muharram is confirmed only when the crescent is visible after sunset, leading to variations in start dates depending on geographic location and methodology. Some communities rely on physical moon sightings, while others use astronomical calculations. This has sparked long-standing debates within the Muslim world over whether to unify the calendar globally or maintain regional independence. Regardless, the emphasis on moon sighting connects Muslims to the rhythm of the natural world. It also invites attentiveness. Looking to the sky becomes a spiritual act. The new year doesn't begin with a digital clock, but with the observation of a sliver of light in the sky, marking both time and transcendence. 7. The earliest physical evidence of Hijri calendar use dates back to the unknown century AH. While the Hijri calendar was established in the 7th century CE, the earliest known inscriptions using Hijri dates come from rocks, coins, and manuscripts from the Umayyad period, 661–750 CE. One of the oldest examples is an inscription on a stone in the Arabian Peninsula, dated to 24 AH. These early uses were often found in administrative or legal contexts such as taxation records, endowments, and building projects. As the Islamic Empire expanded, the need to date documents in a standardized way grew rapidly. The adoption of the Hijri system helped unify diverse regions under a common religious and administrative identity. Over time, the calendar became not just a timekeeping tool but a marker of Islamic civilization itself. These early inscriptions serve as both historical records and cultural artifacts, preserving the moment when Muslims began to count time not just chronologically but spiritually. 8. The Islamic calendar helped standardize legal and religious practices across the empire. When the Hijri calendar was implemented, it provided more than just a timeline. It created a unified system for religious and legal governance. Ritual obligations like fasting in Ramadan, performing Hajj, and paying zakat depend on specific lunar dates. Before standardization, regional differences in timekeeping caused confusion and inconsistency. With the Hijri calendar, judges, scholars, and rulers across the Islamic Empire could refer to the same chronological framework. This helped ensure that rulings, contracts, and religious duties were carried out at the correct times. The calendar thus became a pillar of Islamic jurisprudence, fiqh, shaping how laws were applied and when major events were commemorated. Today, despite technological advancements, Islamic legal scholars still refer to the Hijri calendar to determine the timing of important rulings, including the beginning of Ramadan or the sighting of Shawwal for Eid al-Fitr. It remains essential for maintaining religious order and unity. 9. The Friday, Jumu'ah, prayer, is connected to the lunar calendar's weekly rhythm. While the Islamic calendar is monthly in structure, its sacred rhythm also extends to the week, especially the Friday prayer, or Jumu'ah. Though not directly tied to the new year, Jumu'ah underscores how timekeeping in Islam is both cyclical and sacred. The lunar calendar provides the broader context for annual religious obligations, while the weekly Friday prayer punctuates life with regular spiritual reflection. In early Islamic society, Friday became the centerpiece of communal life, just as Muharram marked the start of the yearly cycle. Together, they formed a pattern: daily worship, weekly gathering, and yearly reflection. During the first Friday of Muharram, some mosques give sermons, khutbahs, that discuss the migration of the Prophet and the significance of the Islamic New Year, further blending weekly and annual spiritual themes. In this way, Islamic timekeeping encourages believers to continually reconnect with their faith on multiple levels. 10. Lunar months were used even before Islam, but the Hijra gave them new meaning. Arab tribes in pre-Islamic Arabia followed a lunar calendar for trade, rituals, and navigation. However, these months were often manipulated for convenience, such as adding or skipping months to align with the solar year, a practice called nasi. When Islam forbade this, it reclaimed the purity of lunar timekeeping. The introduction of the Hijri calendar maintained the traditional month names, e.g., Muharram, Safar, Ramadan, but grounded them in religious significance. With the Hijra as its starting point, the calendar shifted from tribal utility to a sacred framework for Muslim life. What had once been a loose system for scheduling battles or festivals became a disciplined structure tied to divine command. The new year, falling in Muharram, thus symbolizes not just a new beginning, but the transformation of cultural norms into spiritual principles. The calendar's roots are old, but Islam gave them purpose-deing time itself to faith. 11. The 10th of Muharram. Ashura is older than Islam but transformed by it. The day of Ashura, which falls on the 10th of Muharram, was observed by the Quraysh and other Arab tribes before the advent of Islam. It was a day of fasting and reverence, likely inherited from ancient Abrahamic traditions. When the Prophet Muhammad migrated to Medina, he found the Jewish community fasting on this day in remembrance of the liberation of the children of Israel from Pharaoh. The Prophet affirmed the significance of Ashura and initially encouraged Muslims to fast on this day as well. Later, when Ramadan was mandated as the compulsory fast, fasting on Ashura became optional but still meritorious. Over time, especially after the tragedy at Karbala, Ashura gained new meaning, particularly for Shia Muslims, who observe it as a day of mourning. Thus, Ashura represents a convergence of multiple religious heritages, transformed by the Islamic experience and layered with historical, spiritual, and emotional depth. 12. The word Muharram means forbidden, pointing to its sacred status. The name of the first month of the Islamic calendar, Muharram, literally means forbidden. It refers to the pre-Islamic custom, preserved in Islam, of recognizing it as one of the 4 sacred months, during which warfare and conflict were traditionally prohibited. These months, Muharram, Rajab, Dhul Qa'dah, and Dhul Hijjah, were considered times for pilgrimage, peace, and spiritual focus. In Islamic tradition, the sacred nature of Muharram was reaffirmed by the Quran, Surah At-Tawbah 9:36, emphasizing that violating its sanctity was a serious moral breach. The Islamic New Year, therefore, does not begin with noise and festivity, but with a month characterized by quiet restraint and reverence. The name itself calls believers to remember the holiness of time and the ethical dimension of how it's used. Starting the year in a sacred, peaceful month sets a spiritual tone, reminding Muslims that reflection and righteousness should guide their new beginnings. 13. Islamic scholars use the Hijri year-to-date legal opinions, known as fatwas. In classical Islamic jurisprudence, fatwas, formal legal rulings given by scholars, are typically dated according to the Hijri calendar. This dating not only situates the opinion in its proper historical context, but also aligns Islamic law with the sacred flow of time established in the Muslim tradition. Fatwas often deal with time-sensitive matters. When zakat is due, the onset of Ramadan, or inheritance laws following death, all of which require precise calendrical knowledge. By using the Hijri date, scholars maintain continuity with centuries of legal scholarship that predates the widespread use of the Gregorian calendar in Muslim-majority lands. Even in contemporary Islamic courts and scholarly publications, the Hijri year appears alongside the Gregorian one, ensuring that rulings remain grounded in Islamic temporal logic. The new year, therefore, isn't just symbolic, it serves as a legal and scholarly anchor, shaping how Islamic rulings are recorded, referenced, and applied over time. 14. Different regions begin Muharram on different days, due to moon sighting differences. Because the Islamic calendar relies on the lunar cycle, and the appearance of the new moon can vary by location, not all Muslims begin Muharram and, thus the new year, on the same day. For instance, communities in Saudi Arabia may announce the crescent earlier than those in Morocco, India, or the United Kingdom, depending on visibility and whether a literal or calculated moon sighting method is used. These differences sometimes spark debate, especially in globalized societies where Muslims from diverse backgrounds live together. Despite efforts to unify the calendar, most Islamic scholars uphold the validity of local moon sightings, preserving the diversity of practice. This means that Muslims might experience the new year a day or two apart across regions, but they still share a collective sense of its importance. The decentralized nature of the Hijri New Year illustrates the adaptability of Islamic law and highlights the interplay between science, tradition, and communal practice. 15. The Islamic New Year is not a public holiday in most Muslim countries. Surprisingly, in many Muslim-majority nations, the Islamic New Year is not observed as a major public holiday. While some countries such as Indonesia, Egypt, and Jordan officially recognize the 1st of Muharram with a day off, others do not, or they observe it only with minor governmental acknowledgement. In countries like Saudi Arabia, where the calendar itself is based on the Hijri system, the New Year may pass with little more than a prayer or a quiet reflection at home or in the mosque. This contrasts sharply with Eid al-Fitr or Eid al-Adha, which are widely celebrated with feasting, community events, and nationwide holidays. The muted nature of the Islamic New Year reflects its spiritual orientation. It is more about internal renewal than external festivity. Its understated presence in civic life highlights Islam's emphasis on personal accountability and self-discipline over spectacle or public display. 16. Some Islamic scholars discourage celebrating the New Year at all. Throughout Islamic history, many scholars maintain that the New Year should not be treated as a festival. They cautioned against adopting celebratory practices from other traditions that might mimic non-Islamic customs. Instead, they emphasized that the 1st of Muharram should be a day of reflection and prayer. Imam al-Nawawi, a prominent 13th century scholar, noted that while it is recommended to fast in Muharram and perform good deeds, there is no basis in the Sunnah, the teachings of the Prophet, for making the New Year a celebration. This cautious approach reflects a broader principle in Islamic thought. Acts of worship must be rooted in authentic teachings. Over time, this led to a consensus in many parts of the Muslim world to avoid excessive festivities. The Islamic New Year, therefore, is largely free from cultural innovation, bid'ah, preserving its original tone of solemnity and spiritual recalibration. 17. The Islamic calendar has no leap years, but it does adjust via a 30-year cycle. Because the lunar year is approximately 354.37 days long, Islamic calendar designers implemented a 30-year cycle that includes 11 leap years to maintain consistency. These leap years add an extra day to the final month, Dhul Hijjah, making it 30 days instead of 29. This system keeps the lunar calendar somewhat aligned with astronomical reality without shifting it into a solar format. The predictability of the 30-year cycle is particularly useful for long-term religious planning, such as determining the future dates of Ramadan, Hajj, or Muharram. Although Islam discourages altering months, as practiced in pre-Islamic Arabia, this mathematical adjustment ensures the calendar's stability. The Islamic New Year, as part of this refined structure, is not fixed in any solar season but consistently resets itself within the divine order of lunar time. It's a subtle yet sophisticated reminder that even time itself in Islam is divinely measured and morally structured. 18. The Hijra was not a flight of desperation, but a strategic and divine mission. When Prophet Muhammad left Mecca for Medina, it was not merely an escape from persecution. It was a calculated and divinely inspired move to establish a moral society based on Islamic principles. The migration followed years of spiritual preparation and secret negotiations with tribes in Yathrib, later Medina. When the Prophet arrived, he quickly built the first mosque, established a constitution for pluralistic governance, and began transforming social norms. By choosing the Hijra, not a battle or Miracles, the start of the Islamic calendar, Muslims are reminded that faith is not passive. It requires courage, foresight, and action in the face of oppression. The Islamic New Year thus commemorates not only a physical journey but a strategic turning point in Islamic civilization. Every New Year serves as a call to action, asking believers, what are you willing to leave behind for the sake of what is right and just? 19. The term Anno Hijri, AH, was coined by Western scholars centuries later. Although the Hijri calendar was immediately adopted by the Muslim community after its establishment by Caliph Umar, the Latinized term Anno Hijri, or AH, was introduced much later by European Orientalists and scholars of Islamic history. This term mimics Anno Domini, AD, in the Gregorian system, and was used to contextualize Islamic dates within Western historiography. While Muslims themselves use Hijri or abbreviations like H in Arabic-speaking regions, the term AH became widespread in academic and comparative historical texts. This borrowing shows how the Islamic calendar entered global discourse through translation and scholarship, yet the term also subtly reframes Islamic time within a Western paradigm. For Muslims, time according to the Hijra is not merely chronological, it is theological. Each new year marks not just the passage of time, but an opportunity for revival, faith, and moral growth, beyond the sterile digits of secular calendars. 20. The new year often inspires renewed intentions, known as niyyah. At the heart of Islamic spirituality is the concept of niyyah, or intention. While intention is important in all acts of worship, the Islamic New Year is a particularly potent moment to reassess and renew one's purpose. Many Muslims use the start of Muharram as an opportunity to reflect on their spiritual goals, commit to better habits, or leave behind past wrongs. This mirrors the very nature of the Hijra, which was driven by a deep and courageous intention to live by Allah's command, even in the face of adversity. Some families or individuals may write down their goals, increase their charity, or begin new Quranic studies as part of this spiritual reset. Unlike New Year's resolutions driven by material ambition, niyyah is rooted in sincerity and divine accountability. The Islamic New Year, therefore, becomes a time not just for looking ahead, but for realigning oneself with eternal values. 21. Muharram prayers emphasize forgiveness, guidance, and new beginnings. Although there is no specific prayer mandated in the Quran or Hadith for the Islamic New Year, many scholars and devout Muslims have traditionally offered voluntary prayers, Nafli 7 supplications dua, during the first night of Muharram. These prayers often focus on seeking forgiveness for past shortcomings, asking for protection in the coming year, and requesting spiritual clarity. It is not about ritual innovation, but about using a sacred moment to sincerely turn toward Allah. Many Islamic traditions encourage starting new ventures or making significant life decisions during this spiritually charged time, invoking divine guidance. The emphasis is not on ceremonial pomp, but on internal transformation. Mosques may host special lectures or prayer gatherings, but the true observance takes place in the quiet of the heart. In this way, the Islamic New Year fosters a personal renewal that mirrors the Hijra's transformative departure from a life of compromise to one of conviction. 22. Shia Muslims mourn for 10 days at the start of the new year. For Shia Muslims, the first 10 days of Muharram, and especially the 10th day, Ashura, marked by intense mourning for the martyrdom of Imam Husayn, the grandson of Prophet Muhammad, who was killed in the Battle of Karbala in 680 CE. This tragedy occurred on the 10th of Muharram, forever altering the significance of the new year in Shia theology and practice. The new year does not feel like a beginning, but a return to loss. These 10 days are often spent attending mahalis, gatherings, reciting elegies, and engaging in public or private expressions of grief. Some may even participate in dramatic reenactments of the events at Karbala. The sorrow is not merely historical, it is spiritual and political, reminding believers of the price of truth and resistance against tyranny. For Shia communities, the Islamic New Year is not a clean slate, but a call to moral witness through remembrance. 23. Caliph Umar chose Hijra as the calendar's starting point after extensive consultation. When Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab initiated the Islamic calendar, he did not do so arbitrarily. He consulted with close companions of the Prophet, including Ali ibn Abi Talib, Uthman ibn Affan, and others. Multiple dates were considered: the Prophet's birth, the first revelation of the Quran, and the conquest of Mecca. But the consensus formed around the Hijra because it symbolized the beginning of a distinct, self-governing Muslim community, one guided by divine law and collective solidarity. This consultation shows the importance placed on shura, mutual consultation, in Islamic decision-making, even for something as enduring as a calendar. The Islamic New Year, therefore, isn't the result of imperial decree or mathematical convenience. It is a deliberated choice, imbued with religious, ethical, and communal meaning. Umar's decision set a precedent for aligning Islamic governance with spiritual milestones rather than worldly events, and every subsequent year echoes that founding moment. 24. Islamic historians often convert Hijri dates to Gregorian for modern understanding. Because the Hijri and Gregorian calendars differ both in structure and origin, historical research in Islamic studies often involves converting Hijri dates into their Gregorian equivalents. This is not a simple translation. It requires sophisticated astronomical and mathematical calculations. For example, the 1st of Muharram in 1447 AH corresponds to a different Gregorian date each year, moving earlier by about 10-11 days annually. This shifting means that historical Islamic events like the Prophet's migration or the Battle of Karbala occur in different solar seasons depending on the Gregorian frame. Scholars use conversion tables or algorithms to synchronize timelines for academic clarity, especially when comparing Islamic events with global history. The Islamic New Year, when interpreted through both calendars, offers a bridge between sacred and secular chronology. It also reminds researchers and believers alike that while human history is linear, Islamic time cycles through divine rhythms, reinforcing the layered nature of remembrance. 25. The first Islamic state was officially established after the Hijrah, not before. Before the Prophet Muhammad's migration to Medina, the Muslim community was a persecuted minority in Mecca with little political autonomy. It was only after the Hijrah that the first Islamic state emerged, based on a social contract known as the Constitution of Medina. This document ensured coexistence among Muslims, Jews, and pagan tribes, affirming religious freedom, mutual defense, and justice. Thus, the Islamic New Year does not simply commemorate a physical relocation, it marks the moment when Islamic values transition from private belief to public governance. Laws concerning worship, charity, and justice began to be implemented communally, not just individually. The New Year, therefore, recalls the formation of a society where moral law had precedence over tribal loyalty or class privilege. For Muslims today, it is a time to ask how those foundational values, equity, unity, and accountability are reflected in their own communities and governance structures. 26. In Sufi traditions, Muharram is viewed as a spiritual gateway. Within many Sufi schools of thought, the Islamic New Year and the month of Muharram are seen as metaphysical thresholds, a time when the veils between the material and the spiritual are thinner. Sufis emphasize inner migration, paralleling the Prophet's Hijra with the soul's journey from ego nafs to divine proximity. For some Sufi orders, this month is marked by increased dhikr, remembrance of Allah, night vigils, and personal retreat. It is a time for introspection, healing, and the setting of divine-oriented intentions. The new year becomes not just a calendar change, but a moment to renew the heart's alignment with the beloved. Mystical poetry and music often accompany this period, helping practitioners meditate on themes of sacrifice, longing, and divine union. In these traditions, the Islamic New Year is less about events and more about elevation, ascending from one state of being to another, guided by love and discipline. 27. The Hijri calendar influences the scheduling of global Islamic finance. Islamic financial institutions, which follow Sharia-compliant principles, often align their fiscal schedules with the Hijri calendar. Zakat payments, end-of-year audits, and debt maturities may be timed to fall on specific Hijri dates, especially at the close of the lunar year in Dhul Hijjah or the beginning in Muharram. This alignment ensures that financial obligations are not only legal but spiritually timed. For instance, since zakat, obligatory almsgiving, is due annually, many Muslims calculate their assets according to the Hijri year to ensure compliance. In large-scale Islamic finance, this practice adds an ethical dimension to accounting, reminding institutions that wealth management is a form of worship and social responsibility. The Islamic New Year, therefore, is a checkpoint not just for personal reflection but for corporate and communal accountability. It synchronizes economics with ethics and aligns business practices with divine consciousness in a uniquely Islamic manner. 28. Pilgrims returning from Hajj often arrive home just before the New Year. Since Hajj occurs in Dhul Hijjah, the final month of the Islamic calendar, many pilgrims return home during or just before the start of Muharram. This creates a natural spiritual rhythm, moving from the pinnacle of devotion in Mecca to the fresh beginning of a new year. Families often welcome back loved ones with renewed appreciation for faith and a deeper commitment to spiritual growth. The return from Hajj, followed by the Islamic New Year, becomes a symbolic closing and opening, a sacred cycle of departure and renewal. For many, the transition from Dhul Hijjah to Muharram is filled with reflection, storytelling, and sharing of spiritual experiences. It reinforces the idea that the Hijri calendar is not a series of disjointed months, but a continuous journey of ascent, with each event building upon the previous. The new year in this context becomes a reminder that every return is a beginning in disguise. 29. The Islamic New Year is sometimes marked by community service and charity. Although not universally practiced, some Muslim communities use the Islamic New Year as an occasion for charitable outreach and social service. Inspired by the values of Hijra, leaving behind comfort for the sake of righteousness, individuals and organizations engage in food drives, clothing donations, and educational campaigns. These acts reflect the Hijra's moral legacy: care for the displaced, solidarity with the oppressed, and a commitment to justice. In some regions, mosques coordinate with local charities to offer aid to refugees, widows, and orphans during Muharram. These efforts turn the symbolic migration into a tangible act of service, bridging faith and social action. The New Year thus becomes not only a spiritual event but a communal one, where remembrance is expressed not through ritual alone, but through kindness. This practice echoes the Prophet's own priorities upon arriving in Medina, building bonds, establishing justice, and caring for society's most vulnerable. 30. Time in Islam is considered a trust, amana, from Allah. Islamic theology holds that time itself is not just a backdrop for life, it is a divine trust, or amana, entrusted to every human being. The Prophet Muhammad emphasized the value of time, warning that people often take it for granted until it's too late. The Islamic New Year serves as an annual reminder of this trust. It is a checkpoint where believers assess how well they've used their time in devotion, service, and personal growth. Unlike secular calendars that focus on productivity or entertainment, the Hijri calendar is a moral ledger. Each day is an opportunity to fulfill divine purpose, and each year is a chapter in a larger spiritual journey. As the new year begins with Muharram, a sacred month marked by reflection and restraint, it underscores that time is not to be wasted but honored. To mark the new year, then, is to rededicate one's minutes and months to meaning. 31. Islamic calendars differ slightly between Sunni and Shia traditions due to varying lunar interpretations. Although both Sunni and Shia Muslims follow the Hijri calendar, subtle differences sometimes emerge in the observance of certain dates due to divergent methods of moon sighting and historical interpretation. For instance, the beginning of Muharram and the commemoration of Ashura may fall on different days depending on whether local visual sighting or astronomical calculations are prioritized. Moreover, the spiritual emphasis of specific days can differ. For Sunnis, Ashura is often remembered as a day of fasting and gratitude for Moses' deliverance, while for Shias, it centers entirely on mourning the martyrdom of Imam Husayn. These variations reflect deeper theological and cultural nuances within the Muslim world. The Islamic New Year thus becomes a lens through which the rich diversity of Islamic practice is made visible, showing that while the foundational events may be the same, the ways in which they are remembered and honored are shaped by distinct historical narratives and communal experiences. 32. Muharram is considered the Prophet Muhammad's favorite month for voluntary fasting after Ramadan. According to authentic hadith traditions, the Prophet Muhammad singled out the month of Muharram as the most virtuous time for voluntary fasting after the obligatory fasts of Ramadan. In a narration found in Sahih Muslim, the Prophet is reported to have said, "The best fasting after Ramadan is in the month of Allah, Muharram." This hadith not only highlights the spiritual importance of Muharram, but it also signals a unique distinction. It is the only month referred to as the month of Allah. Such an attribution elevates Muharram's sanctity and invites Muslims to begin their year with heightened devotion. Fasting in this month is seen as a way to expiate sins and gain nearness to Allah. Unlike celebratory customs in other cultures, the Islamic New Year is spiritually inward. It begins not with indulgence, but with restraint, quiet reflection, and acts of devotion, particularly through fasting that purifies both body and soul. 33. Some early Islamic scholars recorded unique events that occurred each Muharram to track societal changes. In the formative centuries of Islamic civilization, scholars and historians often used the month of Muharram and the new year it signified as a natural starting point to document significant events and societal trends. These records included major political transitions, natural disasters, wars, peace treaties, and births or deaths of prominent figures. Classical historians like Al-Tabari and Ibn Kathir often organized their chronicles year by year, beginning with, in the year such and such of the Hijrah, during the month of Muharram. This anchoring of historical memory to the Islamic calendar reinforced a worldview in which time was sacred and structured by divine milestones. For these scholars, history was not just a record of events, it was a narrative of moral and religious unfolding. The new year served as a timestamp on the soul of the Ummah, Muslim community, giving each generation a framework to measure change, continuity, and accountability in the light of faith. 34. Some Islamic cultures recite special supplications known as the Dua of the New Year at sunset on the last day of Dhul Hijjah. While not obligatory or rooted in hadith literature, a number of Muslim communities have developed devotional practices surrounding the transition from one Hijri year to the next. Among these is the recitation of the so-called Dua of the New Year at Maghrib sunset, on the last day of Dhul Hijjah, immediately before the Islamic New Year begins. These supplications, passed down through generations, typically ask for forgiveness for the shortcomings of the year that has passed and blessings for the year ahead. Though some scholars caution against attributing formal religious status to these du'as, they are nonetheless cherished traditions in places like Southeast Asia, North Africa, and the Indian subcontinent. The act of gathering to pray at sunset captures the symbolic moment between past and future, making the transition more than a calendar flip. It becomes an intentional spiritual closing and opening, colored by hope, humility, and reverence. 35. The Islamic New Year gradually shifted earlier in the solar calendar, affecting seasonal observance. Because the Islamic lunar year is roughly 11 days shorter than the solar year, the Islamic New Year and all subsequent Hijri months gradually rotate through the seasons. Over a 33-year cycle, every Hijri month will have occurred in every season at least once. This means that Muharram might fall in the sweltering heat of summer one generation and the freezing cold of winter another. In contrast to solar-based calendars which fix religious events to specific times of year, like Christmas in December, the Islamic calendar allows sacred moments to move through the earthly cycle of nature. This movement has profound implications. Fasting, pilgrimage, and remembrance are not confined to comfort or convenience. Instead, they travel through hardship and ease, echoing the Prophet's own journey through shifting landscapes. The Islamic New Year's seasonal fluidity reflects the Islamic worldview that worship and devotion must adapt to life's changing conditions, yet remain constant in purpose. 36. Islamic poets from medieval times often composed verses to mark the new year. In medieval Islamic civilization, poetry was not only a refined art form but also a vessel for moral reflection and spiritual instruction. The advent of the new year inspired poets to compose eloquent verses that captured the fleeting nature of time, the call to repentance, and the hope for divine mercy. Poets such as Al-Mutanabbi and later mystics like Rumi often used the image of Muharram's moon as a metaphor for renewal, sorrow, or divine guidance. In the courts of caliphs or within scholarly circles, New Year poetry would be recited to remind listeners of the year's passage and their proximity to the afterlife. These poems functioned almost like sermons in rhyme, elevating the occasion with literary beauty while conveying profound spiritual themes. The Islamic New Year, in this artistic light, becomes more than a date. It is a muse for reflection, a symbol of mortality, and a canvas for hope, painted in verse. 37. Early Muslim calendars used natural signs, like the date, palm, and star positions, to track time before formal standardization. Prior to the full institutionalization of the Hijri calendar under Caliph Umar, early Muslim communities, like their Arab predecessors, often relied on observable natural phenomena to keep track of time. The blooming of certain flowers, the ripening of the date palm, or the visibility of specific stars would serve as seasonal cues marking the beginning or end of lunar months. These natural indicators, while imprecise by modern standards, were deeply embedded in the daily rhythms of desert life. As Islam expanded and administrative needs grew, a more formal, consistent system became necessary. Yet even after the adoption of the Hijri calendar, some rural or nomadic communities continued to lean on nature's calendar, blending tradition with religious innovation. The Islamic New Year, when viewed through this lens, reminds believers of their ancient connection to the earth and the science spiritual and environmental awareness interwoven into the very fabric of timekeeping. 38. In some cultures, people mark the New Year by visiting cemeteries and praying for the deceased. In various parts of the Muslim world, particularly in Southeast Asia and parts of East Africa, the Islamic New Year is marked by a quiet tradition of visiting cemeteries to pray for deceased relatives and ancestors. Families may clean the grave sites, recite Quran, and offer supplications for mercy and peace upon their loved ones. This act serves a dual purpose, honoring the dead and reminding the living of their own mortality. The New Year becomes a moment not just of personal renewal, but of reconnecting with one's lineage and spiritual heritage. These visits often occur in the early days of Muharram and reflect a communal understanding that life is a temporary trust. Through remembrance of those who came before, Muslims are reminded to live with purpose, humility, and readiness for the hereafter. The cemetery becomes not a place of sorrow, but a sacred space where time converges with eternity. 39. Islamic legal rulings, fiqh, sometimes vary depending on whether a year is a leap year or not. While the Islamic calendar doesn't include leap years in the Gregorian sense of February 29th, it does operate on a 30-year cycle in which 11 of those years have an extra day in the final month, Dhul Hijjah. This additional day can affect certain legal calculations in Islamic jurisprudence. For example, the waiting period, iddah, for widows or divorcees, or the timing for the distribution of inheritance may be slightly extended or adjusted in a leap year. Similarly, the exact calculation of zakatu annually can be influenced by the structure of the lunar year. This precision reflects the holistic nature of Islamic law, which integrates astronomy, ethics, and daily life. The Islamic New Year, then, isn't just symbolic, it is part of a larger system of divine accountability, where even a single day can carry legal and spiritual weight. It underscores the Muslim view that time is measured not merely in hours, but in responsibilities. 40. The word Hijra shares the same root as Hajr, which means to abandon sin. In Arabic, the word Hijra, migration, is etymologically linked to Hajr, meaning to leave or abandon, particularly in the context of leaving sin behind. This linguistic connection deepens the spiritual symbolism of the Islamic New Year. When the Prophet Muhammad left Mecca for Medina, he wasn't just relocating physically, he was departing from a place of oppression and spiritual stagnation toward a land of purpose and divine fulfillment. In the same way, each Muslim is called to make their own internal Hijra, turning away from vice, heedlessness, or moral compromise and striving toward a life aligned with Allah's commands. The New Year, marked by Muharram, becomes a personal challenge. What habits, thoughts, or behaviors must one abandon to begin again with sincerity? This subtle linguistic echo reminds believers that migration is not just geographic, it is ethical. Every new year is a divine invitation to leave behind what no longer serves the soul. In 41, the Islamic New Year was once a key marker in agricultural planning for early Muslim societies. In many early Islamic civilizations, particularly those situated in agrarian environments like Egypt, Iraq, and Al-Andalus, the beginning of the Hijri year was not just a spiritual moment but a practical one. Farmers and local administrators would use Muharram to plan irrigation schedules, planting cycles, and harvest estimations. While the solar calendar was also referenced for seasonal predictability, the Hijri calendar played a central role in religiously significant timelines such as zakat collection from crops, distribution of food, and communal feast coordination. The convergence of the Islamic New Year with agricultural responsibilities highlighted a worldview where faith and livelihood were intertwined. Religious leaders and local officials sometimes coordinated their messages at the New Year to remind landowners of their responsibilities to the poor through zakat. In this way, the Islamic New Year wasn't isolated to mosques and private prayer, it was part of the economic and environmental rhythm of Muslim life. 42. For many Muslims, the Islamic New Year is a preferred time to start reading the Quran anew. Though there is no religious mandate for starting a new Quranic reading cycle in Muharram, many Muslims across different cultures choose this time to begin a fresh recitation or study of the holy text. This personal or communal practice aligns with the theme of spiritual renewal and mirrors how secular New Year resolutions aim to initiate self-improvement. Beginning with Surah Al-Fatiha in the early days of the New Year serves as both a literal and symbolic fresh start. Some mosques offer Quran reading circles, halaqas, beginning in Muharram, where participants commit to reading and reflecting on the Quran regularly throughout the year. This tradition is especially strong in households that prioritize Quranic education for children, using the momentum of the new year to instill discipline and spiritual curiosity. In this context, the Islamic New Year isn't merely observance activated through engagement with revelation, word by sacred word. 43. Political leaders in Islamic history sometimes use the New Year to issue proclamations. Throughout Islamic history, rulers and caliphs occasionally selected the Islamic New Year as the date to announce major reforms, tax policies, or military campaigns. This was not coincidental. Aligning state decisions with the New Year created an aura of renewal and legitimacy, reinforcing the idea that the caliphate or sultanate was working in tandem with divine time. In the Abbasid and Ottoman eras, for example, court scribes and viziers would draft ornate proclamations or edicts, often beginning with verses or phrases invoking the significance of Muharram, a way to spiritually frame worldly decisions. These pronouncements were then read aloud in city squares or mosques, tying the fate of the nation to sacred chronology. The Islamic New Year thus played a dual role. While spiritually quiet and reflective in the lives of many, it also served as a temporal stage upon which the drama of empire, justice, and governance unfolded. 44. The migration that defines the Islamic calendar was not the first attempted by the Prophet's followers. Long before the migration to Medina that defines the Islamic calendar, the Prophet Muhammad instructed a group of his early followers to migrate to Abyssinia, modern-day Ethiopia, to escape persecution in Mecca. This lesser-known Hijra, which occurred more than a decade earlier, involved a small group of Muslims who were welcomed by the Christian king Nagus. Although not the basis for the Islamic calendar, this migration was pivotal in demonstrating that Islam could coexist peacefully with other faiths, and that the search for justice transcended tribal or national boundaries. When the calendar was later established under Caliph Umar, it was the Medina migration that was chosen because it resulted in the establishment of an Islamic state. However, the earlier migration to Abyssinia remains a powerful prelude, showing that the New Year's foundational story is part of a broader narrative of faith, endurance, and refuge in the face of adversity. 45. Some classical Islamic scholars believe that good or bad omens could be perceived in the first days of Muharram. While mainstream Islamic theology discourages superstition, some early scholars and communities held cultural beliefs that the events of the first 10 days of Muharram could set the tone for the entire year. Based on local traditions and folk interpretations not necessarily rooted in Quran or Hadith, people believed that signs seen in dreams, sudden events, or natural occurrences during this period were indicative of divine favor or warning. These beliefs were more prevalent in regions where Islam blended with pre-Islamic cultural practices. For example, a clear night sky on the first of Muharram might be seen as a sign of blessings ahead. Though Islamic orthodoxy eventually distanced itself from these ideas, viewing them as speculative, their presence in historical records offers insight into how the Islamic New Year was experienced across diverse cultures. They illustrate how sacred time is sometimes navigated not only through theology but also through symbolic interpretation and lived intuition. 46. The New Year reminds Muslims of their duty to renew their intentions, known as niyyah. At the heart of Islamic practice is the concept of niyyah, or intention. Every act, whether prayer, charity, or even mundane tasks, gains spiritual significance when done with sincere intention. The Islamic New Year, then, becomes a prime opportunity to revisit and refresh one's niyyah for the months to come. This is especially relevant in a world where habits can become mechanical and routines lose their original purpose. By revisiting their intentions in Muharram, Muslims can realign their daily actions with divine purpose. Scholars and spiritual teachers often advise that this is the time to ask oneself, why am I doing what I'm doing? Have I slipped into heedlessness? Can I begin again with a more mindful spirit? In this way, the Islamic New Year becomes less about what's being done and more about why, reminding the believer that the path to Allah begins not with footsteps, but with the heart's direction. 47. Islamic calligraphy from different centuries often included dates from the Hijri calendar as spiritual timestamps. Artistic masterpieces in the Islamic world, whether Quranic manuscripts, architectural inscriptions, or royal decrees, frequently include Hijri calendar dates. These aren't merely time markers, they are spiritual timestamps that link the work to a particular moment in sacred history. An ornate Quran copied in the year 1000 AH, for example, doesn't just reflect artistic skill, it embeds the act of creation in a continuum that traces back to the Prophet's migration. In many mosques and madrasas, inscriptions above doorways or domes begin with the Hijri year of construction, as though the building itself is a participant in the unfolding of sacred time. The Islamic New Year, in this cultural context, becomes a generational memory keeper. Every year that passes is not just counted, it is inscribed, adorned, and offered as part of the Ummah's collective devotion and legacy. Time in Islam is not invisible. It is carved into history, stone, and scripture. 48. Muharram is one of the 4 sacred months in which fighting is traditionally forbidden. Long before the rise of Islam, certain Arab tribes observed sacred months during which warfare and bloodshed were considered dishonorable. Islam retained and sanctified this tradition, designating 4 months Muharram, Rajab, Dhul Qa'dah, and Dhul Hijjah as sacred. The Quran itself confirms their status, instructing believers to refrain from violence and to treat these months as times of peace and reflection. The Islamic New Year, beginning with Muharram, is therefore enveloped in a spiritual atmosphere of restraint and calm. This is not merely symbolic, it's a profound call to de-escalation, healing, and moral clarity. In times of political unrest or personal conflict, Muharram reminds Muslims that even amid chaos, divine law carves out islands of peace. The new year does not begin with drums of war, it begins with a divine command to lay down arms, soften the heart, and honor the sacred rhythm of time ordained by Allah. 49. The crescent moon of Muharram is often seen as a symbol of spiritual rebirth in Islamic art. In Islamic artistic symbolism, the crescent moon is more than a calendrical marker, it represents spiritual renewal, guidance in darkness, and the cyclical nature of divine mercy. The first sighting of the Muharram moon carries with it a gentle visual metaphor for beginning again. In calligraphy, ceramics, and even architecture, the crescent often appears with verses about hope, forgiveness, or light triumphing over darkness. Artists and poets have long used the Muharram crescent as a motif to express longing for closeness to Allah, or to signal the fresh purity of a new spiritual season. Just as the moon emerges slowly from shadow to light, so too can the soul transition from heedlessness to remembrance. For many Muslims, gazing upon the Muharram crescent is not just a ritual, it is a moment of wonder, a signal that Allah's mercy continues to rise, cycle after cycle, inviting the believer to return. 50. The new year is seen by many scholars as a time to reflect on the hadith of life as a traveler. One of the most cited hadiths during the Islamic New Year is the Prophet Muhammad saying, "Be in this world as though you were a stranger or a traveler." This teaching encapsulates a key theme of the Hijra and of the new year itself. Life is a journey, temporary and purposeful. The migration from Mecca to Medina was not merely geographical, it was the embodiment of that hadith in action. For many Muslims, the start of the year is a time to reassess what baggage they are carrying, both spiritually and emotionally. Are they living as travelers, focused on their destination in the hereafter? Or have they become too attached to temporary stops along the way? The Islamic New Year doesn't call for fireworks or festivity, it calls for recalibration. It is an annual nudge to pack lighter, walk straighter, and move with conviction toward the eternal home promised by Allah. 51. For many Muslims, Muharram serves as a mirror for self-accountability before divine judgment. As the Islamic New Year begins, believers are invited to pause and reflect not just on worldly resolutions, but on their standing with Allah. Muharram, with its solemn atmosphere and deep spiritual resonance, becomes an opportunity to engage in muhasabah, or self-accounting. This inward-facing practice, encouraged by early Muslim sages like Hassan al-Basri, involves reviewing one's actions, intentions, and spiritual direction over the past year. Unlike secular traditions that might focus on external goals, muhasabah centers the heart. It asks, have I grown closer to Allah? Have I wronged anyone? Have I honored the trust of time? In this way, the new year transforms from a social event into a sacred checkpoint. It's not a celebration of having made it through another year, it's a quiet moment of gratitude, repentance, and resolve, framed by the knowledge that each year draws one closer to their final reckoning and return to the divine. 52. The arrival of the Islamic New Year is seen as a fresh opportunity to write one's name among the righteous. In many devotional circles, particularly among Sufis, the turning of the Islamic calendar is more than a chronological event, it's an invitation from Allah to re-enter the book of the righteous. It is believed that just as a person's deeds are recorded daily by angels, so too does the new year offer a renewed chance to fill the coming pages with acts of beauty, mercy, and obedience. Some spiritual teachers describe Muharram as the inkwell of intention, where the pen of destiny awaits the believer's conscious first stroke. Through fasting, prayer, and sincere repentance, one symbolically writes the opening lines of their spiritual year. This sense of active authorship empowers the faithful to begin again, no matter how previous months were spent. The Islamic New Year becomes not just a calendar reset, but a sacred authorship where every action is inked onto the parchment of the soul, witnessed by the divine. 53. The migration of the Prophet wasn't just physical, it redefined the Muslim community's relationship to time itself. When the Prophet Muhammad and his companions left Mecca for Medina, they didn't merely change geography, they shifted the axis of history. That single movement, inspired by divine instruction, became the event from which all future Islamic time would be measured. Unlike other cultures that mark time by the birth of kings or the founding of empires, Islam chose a moral migration, Hijra, the moment zero. This decision speaks volumes about the Islamic conception of history, that it is not power, conquest, or wealth that defines a people, but their commitment to truth and justice. Every Islamic New Year that follows is a subtle reenactment of that decision to leave behind oppression, falsehood, or stagnation, and to journey toward a more just and sacred existence. In this way, time in Islam is not a passive flow, it is a moral compass. The New Year reminds believers that with every moment, one migrates either closer to or further from Allah. 54. Community remembrance during Muharram often strengthens intergenerational transmission of Islamic values. While the Islamic New Year does not involve festive rituals on a grand scale, it plays a powerful role in how families and communities transmit values across generations. In many homes, the arrival of Muharram prompts stories about the Hijra, reflections on the sacrifices of the Prophet's companions, and explanations of Ashura's significance. Children learn not through spectacle, but through story, through the quiet dignity of history passed down in living rooms, mosques, and study circles. Elders may recall how their parents observed the month, or how they first heard the name of Husayn and felt the weight of his sacrifice. In doing so, the New Year becomes an annual bridge connecting past, present, and future. These acts of remembrance aren't merely educational, they are formative. They root the next generation in identity, faith, and purpose, showing that Islam's legacy is not stored in books alone, but in the shared memory of its people. 55. Some Islamic philosophers saw the New Year as evidence of life's circular, rather than linear, rhythm. Whereas Western philosophies often conceptualize time as a straight line moving toward progress or end, many Islamic thinkers, especially those influenced by Sufi or metaphysical traditions, understood time as cyclical. The reappearance of Muharram each year, with its familiar fasts, reflections, and themes, served as a reminder that life moves in sacred spirals, returning to core truths again and again. Thinkers like Al-Ghazali and Ibn Arabi wrote about the soul's journey as one of returning to its divine origin, spiraling inward through purification and remembrance. The Islamic New Year, in this view, is not just a reset, it is a realignment, a point on the circle where the soul is drawn closer to its source. It's not a ladder to climb, but a cycle to complete, with each round offering new depth and insight. The presence of recurring holy months like Muharram reinforces this sacred rhythm, guiding the believer not toward novelty but toward nearness. 56. The Islamic New Year provides a natural break for spiritual retreat and solitude. For those who practice deeper forms of devotion, such as spiritual retreats, khalwa, or itikaf, Muharram offers a fitting moment for solitude and reflection. While these retreats are more commonly associated with Ramadan, many Sufi orders and spiritually inclined individuals choose to begin the year in seclusion, focusing on dhikr, remembrance of Allah, contemplation, and silence. The quiet tone of Muharram, marked by fasting rather than feasting, naturally supports this practice. Seclusion during this time is not an escape from the world, but a preparation to re-enter it with greater clarity and purpose. Some retreatants emerge from their solitude with new goals, inspired poetry, or deeper insights into the Quran. In this way, the New Year is not only marked by what is said or done, but also by what is paused, what is turned inward. It becomes a gateway, not just to a new year, but to renewed presence with Allah. 57. Muharram teaches that sacred time can be both sorrowful and sanctifying. Unlike many global New Year celebrations that are marked by cheer, fireworks, and revelry, the Islamic New Year opens with a month of solemnity and remembrance. Muharram is both a beginning and a memorial. For Shia Muslims especially, the sorrow of Ashura, commemorating the martyrdom of Imam Husayn, sets the emotional tone. But even for many Sunnis, the quiet weight of the month fosters a mood of introspection. This teaches a powerful spiritual lesson, that sacred time is not always joyful, and that sanctity can emerge from suffering. Islam recognizes that renewal does not always come in laughter. It can come in tears, in mourning, and in the resolve born from grief. The new year does not begin with denial of pain, but with the courageous acknowledgement of it. In doing so, it offers a more complete understanding of human experience, that sorrow, when held in faith, can sanctify time and refine the soul. 58. In pre-modern Islamic cities, Muharram processions played a role in shaping urban religious identity. In regions like Iran, India, and Iraq, processions during the first 10 days of Muharram became central expressions of urban religious identity. These were not merely cultural displays, they were embodied rituals of grief, solidarity, and spiritual instruction. Public recitations of the tragedy of Karbala, street theater known as Taziyah, and processions with flags and symbolic relics transformed cityscapes into spaces of collective memory. For centuries, the Islamic New Year in these cities was not a private moment, but a public act of testimony, saying to all who witnessed it that the legacy of Husayn's resistance still lived. These rituals also served to reinforce communal identity and educate future generations. While some of these traditions have been reimagined or relocated due to modern challenges, their impact endures. The Islamic New Year, in such settings, reveals itself as an event of embodied theology, where streets become sanctuaries and movement becomes a form of remembrance. 59. The New Year often sparks charitable initiatives, reminding Muslims to start the year by giving. In many Muslim-majority countries and communities abroad, the beginning of the Hijri year becomes a natural moment for charitable giving. Islamic charities may launch new campaigns during Muharram, encouraging people to make a fresh start by supporting orphans, feeding the poor, or funding educational initiatives. This timing is no accident. Starting the year with charity mirrors the Prophet's teachings that acts of giving purify wealth and elevate the soul. Some households even have the tradition of giving away something on the first day of Muharram, whether a simple meal, clothes, or money, as a way to bless the year ahead. For businesses, it can mean launching new projects with barakah, divine blessing, in mind. The new year becomes not just about self-renewal, but societal uplift. By linking generosity with new beginnings, the Islamic tradition reminds the faithful that the best way to mark time is through compassion. 60. Islamic scholars traditionally used the new year to publish calendars and almanacs for the coming year. Before the digital age, the advent of the Islamic New Year was a time when scholars, astronomers, and printers prepared and distributed calendars and almanacs. These documents were more than date keepers. They included information on prayer times, lunar phases, fasting days, and even advice on health and agriculture. In cities like Cairo, Istanbul, and Delhi, these almanacs were eagerly awaited by merchants, farmers, and families alike. Some included devotional material, moral aphorisms, or hadiths related to time. The effort to distribute such knowledge at the beginning of the year shows how seriously the early Muslim world took the management of sacred time. Receiving a calendar in Muharram was more than organizational, it was spiritual orientation. The Islamic New Year, in this tradition, was not only a personal milestone but a communal moment of synchronization, where believers aligned their lives with celestial rhythms and divine injunctions, guided by scholars who marked the days with purpose. 61. In many Muslim cultures, the Islamic New Year quietly reawakens the concept of divine timing. Rather than viewing time as something to be mastered or scheduled, the coming of Muharram reminds believers that time belongs to Allah al-Zaman. Unlike the secular New Year, which is often centered on personal ambition and productivity, the Islamic New Year opens with a kind of spiritual stillness. In that stillness, Muslims are invited to remember that the events of their lives unfold not merely according to human effort, but divine will. This trust in Qadr, divine decree, is not fatalism but faith. It teaches that beginnings are not always loud or dramatic. Sometimes they arrive as a whisper, calling one back to trust the pace of Allah's wisdom. Muharram's quiet arrival is, in itself, a lesson. Sacred beginnings often come without fanfare, and the deepest transformations happen on divine time, not human clocks. 62. The Islamic New Year invites a rethinking of success through the lens of sacrifice. In a world that measures achievement by accumulation of wealth, status, or milestones, the opening days of Muharram reframe success as measured by sincerity, resilience, and moral courage. The Hijrah of the Prophet was not a triumph in worldly terms. It was an escape, a retreat into the unknown, yet it became the starting point of Islamic civilization. Similarly, the stand of Imam Husayn at Karbala was, by material standards, a defeat, but spiritually, it became a timeless symbol of integrity. These events, memorialized at the New Year, invite believers to reconsider what it means to win. True success, in this tradition, is not found in conquest, but in sacrifice for what is right. With each new year, Muslims are quietly reminded that the path of Allah may not always lead to comfort or applause, but it always leads to meaning. 63. The Islamic New Year is often when scholars and teachers revisit the moral stories of the prophets. In mosques and homes across the Muslim world, the turning of the Hijri calendar becomes a moment not only for reflection but for storytelling. The stories chosen, often centered around struggle, patience, and divine justice, serve as moral anchors for the year ahead. The tale of Prophet Musa, Moses, and Pharaoh is frequently retold around Ashura, highlighting the theme of liberation through faith. The narrative of Prophet Noah, his ark, and the flood offers lessons on perseverance and trust. These stories, drawn from Quranic sources, are not simply religious history, they are spiritual blueprints. Teachers use the new year to remind their communities that divine help often comes after difficulty, and that the arc of sacred time bends always toward justice. The Islamic New Year, then, is not just a marker of days, it is a return to stories that shape the soul. 64. In regions influenced by Persian and Central Asian culture, poetic reflection marks the Islamic New Year. For centuries, the New Year in Islamic Persia, Transoxiana, and the Indian subcontinent was welcomed not only with prayers, but with verse. Poets would compose odes that reflected on the fragility of life, the passage of time, and the soul's yearning for renewal. These poems, often shared in gatherings or transcribed in illuminated manuscripts, carried a dual tone of reverence and realism. They did not flinch from sorrow, especially in the context of Ashura, but also did not lose sight of hope. Through metaphor and rhythm, these poets captured what prose could not: the ache of beginning again, the memory of loss, the stubborn glimmer of spiritual resolve. In these cultures, the Islamic New Year became more than a date, it was a feeling, a shift in the atmosphere, captured in stanzas that echoed long after the first crescent had set. 65. The New Year stirs a subtle shift in how Muslims relate to the future. While Islamic teachings caution against obsessing over what lies ahead, the beginning of the Hijri year naturally invites a forward gaze. But unlike secular notions of forecasting and control, Islam encourages believers to approach the future with humility. The Prophet Muhammad reminded his companions to plan with intention, but never to forget the phrase, "Inshallah, if Allah wills." This balance between hope and surrender is quietly re-emphasized each Muharram. As people think about what they wish to change, build, or heal in the coming months, the Islamic New Year gently tempers that vision. It does not discourage ambition, but redirects it toward divine reliance. What lies ahead is not just a question of strategy, but of submission. The new year becomes a horizon not of certainty, but of trust, and in that trust, peace. 66. Among Muslims in diaspora communities, Muharram often becomes a reconnection point to heritage. Far from ancestral homelands, many Muslim families find in the Islamic New Year a moment to reconnect with the stories, customs, and spiritual textures of their roots. Whether through preparing traditional foods associated with Ashura, reading historical accounts of the Hijra, or attending a local majlis or lecture, the beginning of the Hijri year becomes a way to reclaim identity in unfamiliar lands. For immigrant parents, this moment is often used to transmit values to their children not through obligation, but through shared memory. Even a simple explanation of why the Islamic calendar begins not with triumph but with migration becomes a doorway into deeper belonging. In this way, the new year serves not only as a spiritual milestone, but a cultural tether, a way for displaced hearts to anchor themselves in something enduring, something sacred that cannot be erased by geography. 67. The rhythm of the Islamic calendar reorients the heart away from capitalism's clock. Living in societies where time is sliced into fiscal quarters, sales cycles, and productivity metrics, Muslims who consciously mark the Islamic New Year are reminded that their lives run on a different rhythm. Muharram does not launch a season of consumer frenzy or personal rebranding. Instead, it begins with fasting, silence, and remembrance. There are no advertisements urging people to be their best self by spending more or optimizing their bodies. Instead, the Islamic New Year whispers a quieter message: be present, be accountable, be humble. In this way, the Hijri calendar subtly resists the commodification of time. It does not ignore the world's demands, but it offers a deeper metronomy, a rhythm that beats in sync with the soul, not the market. The new year then becomes not only a spiritual act, but a form of cultural resistance, a refusal to let the sacred be scheduled by profit. 68. The new year offers an opportunity to repair strained relationships before the next chapter begins. One of the often unspoken teachings of Islamic ethics is the emphasis on mending broken ties. While Ramadan is usually highlighted as a time of reconciliation, many Muslims quietly use the Islamic New Year as a less crowded, more sincere moment to reach out, to forgive, to apologize, or simply to reconnect. There is something symbolically powerful about beginning a new year without lingering bitterness. The Prophet Muhammad emphasized that keeping ties of kinship, Silat al-Ram, is a pathway to divine mercy and extended lifespan. Starting the year with a softened heart, an open door, or even a single text message to someone estranged becomes an act of both courage and worship. In a faith that values peace not only between nations but between neighbors, the new year is an understated chance to make things right not just with Allah, but with each other. 69. In certain cultures, the Islamic New Year is marked by lighting a single lantern or candle at dusk. While not a universally observed tradition, in parts of North Africa and Southeast Asia, families may mark the evening of the Islamic New Year with the quiet lighting of a lantern. This small act carries layered symbolism. It is a gesture of hope, remembrance, and prayer for guidance in the year ahead. The flame represents continuity with past generations who honored sacred time with simple beauty. Children are sometimes invited to say a prayer as the light is kindled, making the new year a participatory moment of reflection. There is no pageantry or noise, just the soft glow of intention, illuminating a space where Allah's presence is gently invoked. In these homes, the new year does not begin with noise, but with light, quiet, warm, and enduring. 70. The Islamic New Year reminds believers that beginnings can coexist with grief. Muharram does not ask Muslims to choose between mourning and renewal, it invites them to hold both. In commemorating the tragedies of Karbala, while also acknowledging the start of a new year, the tradition teaches that life is not segmented into clean emotional compartments. One can carry sorrow and still move forward. One can remember loss and still plant seeds of hope. This emotional complexity is not seen as a contradiction, but as truth. The Islamic New Year, through its structure and symbolism, affirms that faith is not a bypass around pain, it is the strength to walk through it with Allah. In a world that often demands emotional certainty, happy, be positive, be over it, the Hijri New Year offers something far more real, permission to feel deeply and to begin anyway. 71. The Islamic New Year is a subtle reminder that not all holy moments are loud. In many religions, the most sacred days are marked by fanfare, trumpets, fireworks, masses of people. But the first day of Muharram often arrives in silence. No public holiday in many countries. No major communal rituals, no countdown clock. And yet, in that very absence of spectacle, the day carries profound spiritual weight. For Muslims attuned to the rhythms of the Islamic calendar, the quietness itself becomes the sign. Like a breath before prayer, like the hush before dawn, the beginning of the year asks not for celebration but for stillness. And in that stillness, the believer meets Allah not in distraction, but in depth. The Islamic New Year doesn't demand attention, it invites awareness. It is a sacred whisper in a world of shouting, reminding the heart that holiness often slips in through the side door, unnoticed by crowds but unmistakably felt by those who are watching for it. 72. In Islamic tradition, intention, niyyah, gives the new year its true meaning. The concept of niyyah intentionis is not just a footnote in Islamic jurisprudence, it is the very heartbeat of spiritual life. With the arrival of the new year, this principle takes center stage. It is not the day itself that carries power, but how the believer meets it. Two people might fast on the same day, speak the same words, attend the same gathering, but without intention, the acts remain hollow. The Prophet Muhammad emphasized that every deed is judged by its intention, and the new year is no exception. As the crescent of Muharram appears, believers are reminded to ask themselves not just what they will do this year, but why. The Islamic New Year is thus not an external event, but an internal alignment. It doesn't ask for resolutions, it asks for sincerity. And in that subtle shift from performance to purpose, the new year begins with depth rather than decoration. 73. For many, Muharram is the beginning of a new cycle of Quranic recitation. Devout Muslims often approach the Quran not as a book to be read once, but as a companion to circle endlessly. And for some, Muharram is the moment they turn back to the first verse of Surah Al-Fatiha, recommitting to a fresh journey through the sacred text. This annual practice echoes the rhythm of the Islamic calendar itself, cyclical, reflective, always returning to the source. Beginning anew in Muharram isn't merely symbolic. It reinforces the Quranic ethos that every return to Allah is welcomed, every act of sincere devotion honored. The believer doesn't just restart the Quran to read more, but to become more. Each recitation becomes a spiral deeper into the soul's truth, shaped by the growth of the previous year. In this way, the Islamic New Year doesn't mark an endpoint, or a fresh slatate marks a spiral staircase rising steadily toward the divine. 74. In Sufi circles, the New Year is often greeted with spiritual poetry and remembrance. Among Sufi communities, the beginning of the Islamic year is not left unnoticed. It is met with dhikr, remembrance of Allah, poetry, and spiritual gathering. While devoid of outward pomp, these intimate assemblies carry intense inner power. The words of Rumi, Hafiz, or Ibn al-Farid may be recited not as art for art's sake, but as a vehicle for divine proximity. The Sufi understanding of time is not chronological but luminous. Each sacred month, especially Muharram, opens a gate to divine qualities. The New Year then becomes a night of return where seekers reaffirm their longing, their love, and their hope for nearness to the beloved. In these circles, the year is not counted in days or months, but in degrees of presence. One may leave the night without a resolution, but with something far more lasting, a rekindled fire in the heart. 75. The New Year draws attention to the power of spiritual migration even when no travel occurs. Hijrah, the event that defines the Islamic calendar, was a physical migration, but its meaning extends far beyond geography. The Prophet's movement from Mecca to Medina becomes an eternal metaphor for all who leave behind the familiar in pursuit of truth. As the New Year arrives, believers are asked to examine their own lives. What must be left behind? What inner Mecca-wat comforts, attachments, or false idols must they part with? And what is their Medina calling, their spiritual destination? This inward migration does not require a passport, only courage. The Islamic New Year becomes then a moment of recalibration, a reorientation of the soul, a reminder that to be Muslim is to be in motion not always outwardly, but always inwardly. Even if the feet remain still, the heart is asked to walk. 76. The sacredness of Muharram spills into dreams and visions for many mystically inclined Muslims. Throughout history, particularly in mystical traditions, the month of Muharram has been associated with heightened spiritual sensitivity. Some believers report vivid dreams during this period, encounters with ancestors, symbolic visions, or intense emotional experiences that arrive at night like whispered messages. These dreams are not seen as fortune-telling, but as signs echoes from the unseen, arriving just as the new year begins. For mystics, the veil between the worlds feels thinner in sacred time, and Muharram, as the door to a new cycle, offers a liminal space. It is a threshold where the old lingers, the new beckons, and the soul, if attentive, may catch a glimpse of deeper truths. Whether in dream or wakefulness, the new year offers more than a change in calendar. It offers openings into the invisible, where the language is silence and the guide is the heart. 77. The Islamic New Year humbles the believer before the cosmic order. In the quiet observance of the Islamic New Year, one is reminded not only of personal time but of cosmic time. The moon, whose crescent marks the beginning of each month, becomes a symbol of divine rhythm. It waxes and wanes with precision, never early, never late, reflecting the Quranic reminder that Allah has set everything in its proper measure. The Islamic calendar is lunar, not solar, and thus always slightly out of step with modern systems. But that disruption is part of the beauty. It decenters human expectation and recenters divine timing. The believer is reminded that life flows not by convenience but by command. The Islamic New Year is not a marker we impose on the world. It is a moment we receive. In its humility and unpredictability, it trains the soul to surrender, not to clocks, but to the cadence of the cosmos. 78. In some Muslim households, children are introduced to the Prophet's life through stories of the Hijrah. Rather than diving into theological complexities, many Muslim parents use the Islamic New Year to gently introduce their children to the life of the Prophet Muhammad, starting with the Hijrah. Told in storybook tones, The journey from Mecca to Medina becomes more than history. It becomes a tale of courage, loyalty, and trust in Allah. Children learn how the Prophet and Abu Bakr hid in the cave, how Allah protected them, how people risked everything for the truth. These stories are not just bedtime tales, they're blueprints. In the telling, children are shown that faith means movement, that Allah's protection is real, and that beginnings sometimes come through escape. The new year, then, becomes not only a spiritual milestone but an educational one. A sacred story is passed down not from book to reader, but from heart to heart. 79. The Islamic New Year disrupts worldly cycles to center sacred purpose. In a society where years are often delineated by tax seasons, fiscal quarters, or vacation calendars, the Islamic New Year slips in like a gentle interruption. It doesn't align with January honest. It doesn't follow the logic of global capitalism. It appears unexpectedly, by the moon, in a rhythm indifferent to corporate schedules. And in that misalignment, it asserts something radical, that sacred time is its own reality. It moves by a divine tempo. For Muslims who choose to live by the Hijri calendar, even partially, this dissonance is intentional. It recenters life around prayer times instead of deadlines, around revelation instead of revenue. The Islamic New Year, then, isn't a mere alternative. It's a reclamation, a quiet revolution of the clock, where the soul, not the market, sets the pace. 80. Muharram offers a sacred contrast to the noise of the world's New Years. When the Gregorian New Year arrives, the world often explodes with fireworks, concerts, and countdowns. There is noise, glitter, and a kind of intoxicated joy. In contrast, the Islamic New Year arrives with the sound of recitation, the rustle of pages, the clink of dates in a bowl for breaking a fast. Where one celebrates motion, the other invites pause. Where one promises self-invention, the other invites self-surrender. This contrast is not a critique of celebration, it's a call to consciousness. Muharram doesn't ask believers to avoid joy, but to anchor it, to begin not with noise, but with intention. The Islamic New Year, in this way, becomes not just a different celebration, but a different worldview. It reminds the heart that not all beginnings need to shout. Some simply need to be heard. 81. The Islamic New Year serves as a mirror to reflect on mortality. Unlike cultural New Year celebrations that center on longevity, vitality, and extended plans, the arrival of Muharram quietly turns the believer's gaze inward toward the brevity of life. The opening of the Hijri calendar is not punctuated by noise, but by remembrance. The Prophet Muhammad advised his followers to remember death often, not to live in fear, but to live in truth. With the dawning of a new Islamic year, the soul is prompted to ask, how many years have I been given, and how many remain? The calendar shift becomes more than just a chronological change. It is a moment of existential accounting. Time, in Islam, is not a resource to be spent thoughtlessly. It is a trust, a amana, that demands mindfulness. The Islamic New Year, therefore, is less a celebration of quantity and more a meditation on quality. How deeply, how justly, how sincerely have I lived? 82. The spiritual mood of Muharram allows space for collective grief in a culture that often hides it. Much of the modern world avoids grief, sidesteps it, minimizes it, covers it in platitudes. But the Islamic New Year, especially as it unfolds into Ashura, makes room for sorrow. In commemorating the martyrdom of Imam Husayn and the tragic events of Karbala, the Ummah, Muslim community, acknowledges pain not as a detour from the spiritual path, but as part of it. This collective remembrance creates a rare moment where public vulnerability is not only allowed, it is sacred. Tears are not signs of weakness, but of sincerity. Whether through poetry, elegy, or processions, Muslims are reminded that sorrow, when turned toward Allah, becomes a form of devotion. The new year begins not with denial of pain, but with its embrace, teaching that in mourning with dignity, the soul finds healing. In this way, the Islamic New Year stands apart. It offers a container for grief in a world that often offers none. 83. The month of Muharram challenges the idea that history is written only by the victors. In secular chronicles, power often defines narrative. Those who conquer, who build empires, who dominate economies. But the Islamic New Year, through its anchoring in the Hijra and Ashura, tells a different kind of story. It honors the ones who walked away from power, who endured persecution, who refused to surrender truth for safety. The emigration of the Prophet was not a conquest. It was a strategic retreat that led to spiritual expansion. The martyrdom of Husayn was not a military victory. It was a moral stance that reshaped history. These events, remembered at the very start of the Islamic calendar, elevate principle over politics, ethics over empire. By placing these moments at the threshold of each new year, Islam teaches its followers that success is not determined by dominance, but by faithfulness. In a world that often forgets the cost of integrity, Muharram insists on remembering. 84. The Islamic New Year arrives without commercial incentive, making its sincerity more palpable. There are no marketing campaigns for Muharram, no seasonal discounts or themed merchandise pushing consumption. In fact, in many parts of the world, the day comes and goes without media acknowledgement. Yet for many Muslims, that very absence makes the observance more real. Without consumer noise, the Islamic New Year becomes a space untouched by commodification, a sacred pocket of time where reflection is not sold, but chosen. The soul is left to approach the day quietly, without external prompts or pressures, and in that quietness, sincerity emerges. Those who mark the new year do so not for social performance, but for spiritual need. The simplicity of the moment becomes its depth. The Islamic New Year, then, offers something increasingly rare, a sacred occasion unsullied by spectacle. It asks nothing of the believer but attention, and in that asking, it offers everything. 85. Among African Muslim communities, Muharram often blends remembrance with local cultural expression. In West Africa, the Islamic New Year does not erase indigenous tradition, it often weaves into it. From the Sufi brotherhoods of Senegal to the Tijani gatherings in Nigeria, the beginning of the Hijri year is marked not only by dhikr and fasting, but by community celebrations that incorporate drums, call and response chants, and storytelling. Elders recite the history of the Hijra or recount the stand at Karbala, embedding sacred memory within cultural rhythm. Children learn faith through song. Women, often the keepers of oral tradition, preserve and transmit these tales with the cadence of poetry. In these communities, the New Year is not a moment of isolated reflection. It is a living, breathing tradition. It is the past held in the body, sung from the tongue, passed hand to hand. The Islamic calendar thus becomes not just a measure of time, but a tapestry of culture and continuity. 86. The crescent moon of Muharram holds special weight in the hearts of skywatchers. Among those who track the lunar calendar with devotion, the sighting of the new moon for Muharram is more than astronomy. It is anticipation, wonder, and spiritual readiness all rolled into one. In many traditional communities, local moonsighters climb rooftops or hills, peering toward the horizon for the faint glimmer of silver. When it is seen, a quiet jubilation spreads, not boisterous, but sacred. It's as if the heavens themselves have turned the page, whispering, "Begin again." This act connects the believer to both earth and sky, to the ancient rhythm of creation itself. The moon does not rush, it simply appears when it is meant to. And in that unveiling, it models a kind of surrender that the soul longs to mirror. The Islamic New Year does not arrive by decree, it arrives by sight, by wonder, by looking up. 87. Muharram revives the legacy of moral dissent in Islamic history. To mark Muharram is to remember Karbala, and to remember Karbala is to honor the sacredness of speaking truth to power. Imam Husayn's refusal to endorse a corrupt leadership was not just an act of personal conviction, it was a theological stance that has echoed across centuries. The new year thus becomes more than a time of devotion. It becomes a call to conscience. In a world where moral compromise is often rewarded and silence is seen as safer, Muharram reminds the believer that dignity sometimes means defiance, that loyalty to Allah may demand disloyalty to injustice, that even in isolation, one's stand can echo across generations. This is not merely Shia heritage, It is a lesson for all who revere integrity. The Islamic New Year, by beginning with such a powerful act of resistance, asks, what are you willing to lose for the truth? 88. Muharram invites Muslims to realign their inner calendar with sacred time. In daily life, most people move by schedules, work hours, academic terms, holidays marked in red on secular calendars. The Islamic New Year disrupts this rhythm, not forcefully, but gently. It calls the believer to remember that there is another time running parallel to this 1 time marked by worship, remembrance, sacrifice, and divine events. Sacred time moves not in fiscal quarters but in moral cycles. With each new year, Muslims have a choice: to continue being shaped by external demands, or to pause and reorient toward the divine timeline. The sighting of the crescent becomes a spiritual alarm clock, awakening the soul to the deeper rhythms it may have forgotten. Muharram does not demand abandonment of worldly life, it offers the opportunity to sanctify it, to live in the world, but by heaven's time. 89. The New Year serves as a reminder that some beginnings emerge from endings. The Hijra itself came after immense persecution, social ostracization, and danger. Karbala came after betrayal and abandonment. And yet, these moments of loss became foundations of legacy. The Islamic New Year, by rooting itself in these histories, teaches a paradox of faith, that what seems like an ending may, in Allah's wisdom, be a beginning in disguise. For those entering the year weary, heartbroken, or uncertain, this is not just comfort, it's transformation. Muharram doesn't demand that you be whole before you begin. It simply asks you to begin, to trust that with Allah, every heartbreak holds the seed of renewal. That sacred history was built not by those who always won, but by those who never gave up. The new year is not a blank slate, but a stained one marked with loss, but ready for meaning. 90. The Islamic New Year reminds Muslims that time itself can be an act of worship. While acts like prayer, fasting, and charity are clearly understood as spiritual, Islam also elevates time itself as sacred when it is lived with intention. The Prophet Muhammad lived with such deep mindfulness of time that his companions knew him to count moments as others count treasure. With the coming of the Islamic New Year, Muslims are invited into this same awareness. Not just to plan their days, but to sanctify them. Not just to manage time, but to serve within it. Every hour becomes an opportunity for remembrance. Every season a chapter in divine proximity. The passage of time is no longer a threat or a scarcity, it is a field in which worship grows. The Islamic New Year, therefore, is not simply a date, it is a doorway, a chance to walk not faster but deeper. 91. The Islamic New Year offers a rare spiritual quiet that welcomes introverts of the soul. While some sacred days call for communal worship and collective rituals, Muharram opens with a gentler invitation known that speaks to the inner world. It asks no public performance, no loud celebration. It speaks softly, appealing to those who find Allah in solitude, in pages turned by candlelight, in whispered supplications made behind closed doors. For many, the Islamic New Year is not about being seen, but about seeing more clearly where they've come from, where they're going, and who they've become. It provides sanctuary from a world that often rewards noise and haste. In that sanctuary, introverts of the spirit find permission to simply be reflective, observant, honest. This new year doesn't require a gathering to be sacred. Sometimes, the most transformative journeys begin with a single soul and the silence of a new moon. 92. In families across the world, the Islamic New Year quietly shapes identity across generations. While its arrival may not be met with fireworks or televised countdowns, the Islamic New Year quietly plants its roots in family traditions. A father might remind his children of the Prophet's migration, connecting their bedtime stories to the arc of history. A grandmother may prepare a special dish or recite a prayer passed down for generations. These small rituals, barely noticeable to outsiders, become formative threads in a family's spiritual fabric. Over time, they build identity. Not the loud kind that is declared in slogans, but the rooted kind that is lived in rhythm, story, and memory. Through these acts, the Islamic New Year becomes more than a date on the calendar, it becomes inheritance, a gentle pulse passed from heart to heart, home to home, shaping not only faith, but belonging. 93. Muharram reawakens the believer's moral compass in a world that rewards neutrality. It is easy, in an age of complexity and compromise, to believe that neutrality is wisdom, that to stay silent in the face of injustice is to remain safe or balanced. But the stories that echo through Muharram push against that comfort. The Prophet's emigration was not a neutral act, it was a stance against oppression. Imam Husayn's martyrdom was not silence, it was defiance. The Islamic New Year reawakens this moral clarity. It whispers that truth may cost you, but silence may cost you more. That in every era, a Karbala emerges, asking each soul, will you stand, or will you look away? This isn't about taking sides for the sake of conflict, but about aligning your heart with justice, even when it's inconvenient. Muharram does not ask for loud outrage, it asks for sincere allegiance to principle. And that, too, is a beginning worth marking. 94. The Islamic New Year reminds Muslims that exile can lead to sacred purpose. Hijra, at its heart, is a story of exile. The Prophet and his followers left behind their homes, their safety, and their roots not out of preference, but out of principle. And yet, from that displacement emerged a community, a revelation, a transformation. For those who have been forced to leave homelands, who carry passports that don't match their sense of home, Muharram speaks directly to their hearts. It says, exile is not the end of the story. It can be the beginning of a new one if carried with integrity. The New Year does not glorify suffering, but it does honor the dignity of those who endure it for the sake of truth. In a time of global migration and dislocation, this memory becomes more than symbolic. It becomes healing. The Islamic calendar begins with exile, not to romanticize pain, but to show that even displacement can be a doorway to divine destiny. 95. The sacred timing of Muharram offers a different form of abundance. In worldly calendars, the beginning of a new year often revolves around accumulation, more money, more goals, more status. But the Islamic New Year redirects the gaze. It does not promise gain in numbers, but in nearness to Allah, to truth, to oneself. It shifts the definition of wealth from what can be measured to what can be carried in the soul. Fasting in Muharram, reflecting in solitude, giving in charity, these acts do not increase one's possessions, but they enrich one's spirit. This is a different kind of abundance zone that isn't diminished when shared, one that cannot be taxed, stolen, or lost. The crescent of the new year offers no guarantee of material growth, but it offers something deeper, the chance to grow in mercy, in awareness, in surrender, and perhaps that is the kind of prosperity most worth seeking. 96. Muharram subtly shifts the definition of courage. In dominant cultures, courage is often portrayed as physical strength, aggressive bravery, or charismatic defiance. But the stories honored in Muharram reveal a quieter, deeper kind. The courage to stand alone, the courage to mourn publicly, the courage to resist not just enemies, but temptations of ego. Imam Husayn's stand at Karbala was not about brute force, was about moral clarity. The Prophet's migration was not about conquest, it was about trust. As Muslims enter the Islamic New Year, they are reminded that courage often looks like restraint, that the mightiest stands may be those taken in prayer, in forgiveness, or in refusing to comply with injustice. The courage honored in Muharram is not lauded as luminous, and that redefinition may be one of the most powerful gifts the New Year brings. 97. The Islamic New Year has long been a quiet spiritual resistance to temporal power. Kings and emperors once sought to control calendarsto, defined time itself as a tool of political power. But the Islamic calendar has always followed the moon, not the throne. It resists centralization, following celestial order rather than political decree. And within it, the new year comes without royal parades or imperial decrees. Instead, it arrives through community sighting, remembrance, and tradition. In this way, the Hijri calendar becomes a form of sacred autonomy, answering not to nations, but to revelation. The Islamic New Year, then, is not just a religious observance. It is a quiet act of spiritual resistance, a way to live time differently, to remember differently, and to root identity not in the rise and fall of earthly rulers, but in the enduring truth of faith. The crescent moon becomes a crown of a different kingdom ruled by justice, humility, and divine mercy. 98. The Islamic New Year continues the legacy of prophetic patience. The Prophet Muhammad's migration was not immediate. It came after years of insult, injury, and heartbreak. And when it finally happened, it did not end hardship, it simply opened a new chapter. This is the rhythm that the Islamic New Year encodes into the soul. Transformation requires time. It honors the kind of patience that doesn't simply wait, but works, that holds the vision while enduring the wilderness. For Muslims today, Muharram becomes a yearly invitation to practice that same patience, to remain steadfast even when results don't arrive quickly, to trust the unfolding of divine timing, even when it is painful or slow. This patience is not passive, it is purposeful. And in remembering the Prophet's own timeline, the believer is reminded that slowness is not failure. It may in fact be the rhythm of real change. 99. Muharram calls attention to the power of memory in shaping moral identity. In Islamic tradition, memory is more than recollection, it is moral inheritance. The stories retold during Muharram are not entertainment or nostalgia, they are blueprints. They teach the young what matters, remind the old what endures, and anchor the whole community in shared ethical memory. Without memory, justice becomes abstract. With it, the believer knows what has been sacrificed and what must be preserved. As the Islamic New Year begins, Muslims are called not just to look ahead, but to look back with reverence, with clarity, with commitment. Karbala is not just an event, it is a living reminder. The Hijra is not just a migration, it is a moral compass. In these acts of remembrance, identity is formed not by slogans, but by story. Muharram ensures that Muslims begin each year not just with hope, but with history. 100. The Islamic New Year is a soft-spoken invitation to begin again differently. No fireworks mark its arrival. No global countdown ushers it in. Yet, the Islamic New Year extends an invitation more profound than any resolution. It doesn't promise reinvention. It whispers of return. Return to Allah. Return to the path. Return to the self before it was cluttered by noise. It is not a moment to announce new goals, but to realign with old truths. In a world obsessed with doing more, being more, chasing more, the first night of Muharram offers something rare. Permission to pause, to reflect, to begin not with ambition, but with awareness. It asks nothing but sincerity, and offers everything in return. To begin again is not weakness, it is wisdom. And with each year, the crescent moon curves into the sky like a quiet door, opening once more, asking only that you step through heart first. The Islamic New Year arrives not with clamor, but with quiet. It does not rush in to be noticed, nor demand celebration to be felt. Yet in its gentle unfolding, it carries centuries of memory, resistance, renewal, and faith. Through these 100 facts, we've journeyed across moments of migration and martyrdom, silence and symbolism, personal reflection, and communal resilience. We've discovered that the Islamic New Year is not merely a date, is a sacred pause, a realignment, a doorway. It is a call to remember not just what happened in history, but what is happening in us now. It reminds us that beginnings do not always require fireworks. Sometimes they require fasting, or tears, or simply the courage to begin again with more intention than before. In a world that rushes forward, the Islamic New Year invites us to look back, step inward, and walk ahead rooted in something deeper than the calendar, in truth, in remembrance, in Allah. Let the crescent not just mark time, but transform it. Let the year not just pass, but purify.